Okay, welcome back. So I think something that's really important to know is that in the period where Socrates, in his sort of midlife, when he is becoming very famous as someone who walks in the streets and asks questions, um, first is that there is a whole new generation of professional teachers that has never existed before in the ancient Greek world. They were called sophists from the Greek word for wisdom, or wise, sophos, or wisdom, Sophia. And Socrates was different in that he didn't charge anybody for his knowledge or for his kind of consulting and advice. He was a very strange person. He did this because he seemed honestly motivated by wanting to get answers to these questions about how to live and how people could live better in this city. So the Peloponnesian War breaks out when Socrates is, we think, around 40 years old. And within the next 5 years were an absolute disaster. One of the strategies of Pericles, the great citizen of the Golden Age of Athenian democracy, was to try to create a defensive a system for Athens, a series of walls that would, because Athens was supreme at sea, and they created a set of walls that would connect the port to the center of the city where the Acropolis and Agora were, as a way of saying, look, you, Sparta, you might have a more powerful land army, but we're going to build these walls so that trying to invade us would be futile. Well, Pericles underestimated that Sparta might go to war for seemingly illogical reasons, including its national pride, and he underestimated, because he didn't know about microbes and epidemics, the public health risks of gathering tens of thousands of people into a cramped space for months at a time. And so a disease broke out, and this disease killed somewhere between a quarter and a third of all men, women, and children in the city. So imagine that a war is started. The Spartans are invading. You are the most powerful city in Greece, but you quickly are under the dual stress of losing sons and husbands and fathers in battle, as well as losing, grandparents and babies and daughters and friends to the plague. Socrates in this time serves as a democratic citizen of Athens with distinction and defends and risks his life for his city in the battles of Delium and Amphipolis. The war temporarily comes to a halt in 421. Socrates continues his philosophical discussions. The tragedies and comedies continue to be played, and his followers grow. And there was actually a comedy written by Aristophanes that makes fun of Socrates called The Clouds. So he becomes a real celebrity in this time. But one of his students, Alcibiades, takes a greater and greater role in the politics of the city, and he's behind one of the most disastrous choices that the Athenian democracy ever made, which is to invade the island of Sicily, which was a very rich part of the Greek world, and under somewhat dubious claiming that they're responding to the request of a Sicilian city for help, but in fact it was to expand their empire. And so the desire for empire got to the heads of a majority of the assembly, and they voted for this, what ended up being a disastrous campaign that significantly weakened Athens, to the point where a few years later they finally lose the war definitively to Sparta. And in the place of the democracy, the Spartans install 30 Athenian citizens, including several of Socrates' former students like Critias and Charmides, to rule as tyrants, what we call the trikonta, or 30 tyrants. During their very brief reign, their government, they create a reign of terror in which approximately 1,500 citizens are executed and many more exiles. This is looked at as a very dark, very violent period in Athenian history at one of the lowest points where they had lost this war against Sparta. A democratic resistance led by a naval officer named Thrasybulus overthrows the 30 tyrants, and instead of returning the reign of terror with reprisals, institutes an amnesty that says we will forgive all of the abuses that happened during the 30 tyrants, uh, officially, but of course everybody knew that these 30 tyrants had caused enormous harm at a time of enormous stress and trauma in the community. And so officially they were not executed or exiled, but many of them went and did voluntary exile, and tensions remained. And so because Socrates, he had not helped the 30 tyrants, but neither had he joined the resistance, and several of the 30 tyrants had personal connections to Socrates. This is the background in which his prosecutors, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, who were part of this new democratic government in Athens, bring charges against Socrates for, as we see in the Apology, the twin charges of corrupting the youth and impiety, introducing false gods. And so this is the context in 399 BC where the trial is convened before 500 randomly selected Athenian citizens. And Socrates must go on trial for his life. At that trial, more likely than not, was his star student, whose name was Aristocles, but we know him by a different name because he was a very athletic, well-built, broad-shouldered guy. And so he got the nickname Platon by his friends, which means, big shoulders, broad guy. And Platon is how we know him today, by the name Plato, even though that wasn't the name he was born with. And we believe that he attends the trial of Socrates, and we don't think that he made it to, of course, spoiler alert, Socrates loses the trial and ends up committing suicide by judicial decree. And in the dialogue later that he writes later about the last day of Socrates' life, is the one time in all of his dialogues where he refers to himself in the mouth of one of his characters that he was ill. So one of the ways we can read this is that Plato, who was maybe one of the most brilliant people ever to be produced by the Athenian democracy, had a nervous breakdown at the death of his teacher Socrates by a majority vote of this jury. He later founds the first institution of higher learning in Western culture dedicated to research and teaching called the Academy in a grove of the suburb of the city, which becomes the basis for all Western universities, and then spends the rest of his life writing dialogues, many of which feature Socrates as the main character, and which we see him in discussion, in dialogue with citizens and with these other sophists, and including dialogues, the Apology and the Crito, where we see him on trial and we see him in jail on death row. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is a couple things to keep in your mind as you read these dialogues, the Apology and the Crito. So the Apology, don't be fooled by the name. Socrates is not apologizing. He's not saying he's sorry. The word apology comes from the Greek word logos, which means speech. So apo and logos means from his speech. So this is from his speech that he gives at his trial. And as you'll see, he's definitely not sorry for having practiced philosophy. And so I want you to think, what is the story that Socrates tells about his philosophical career? And in your mind, does this answer the charges against him or not? Is he making some other kind of point? Do you think Socrates presents himself more as an insider or an outsider in this speech? And then as we get towards the Crito, where he's sitting on death row and his friend Crito tries to bribes the jailer to get in and gives Socrates the offer to get him out of prison, and Socrates says no. So the questions I want you to think about, both in the Apology and then moving in the Crito, is what is Socrates' attitude towards compromise? And is this one that you think advocates should follow today? What's his attitude towards the rule of law? And is it one we should follow today? And finally, what's his attitude towards self-preservation? And is it one that we should follow today? So those are the questions. I want you to enjoy this reading and be ready to come to class and discuss. Looking forward to meeting you soon.